Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Jim Tritten is an ex-Navy pilot. He flew off aircraft carriers in locations around the world and then went on to work for the government in a variety of classified positions. That is, until his past as a pilot came back to haunt him. While flying, he had a nearly deadly accident that led to an investigation and unwarranted blame for it all. He put the incident behind him and kept charging forward. He never thought about it, never spoke about it. But years later, he could no longer ignore the trauma. It was surfacing in his life in ways that were unhealthy and even dangerous. Given his security clearances, a diagnosis of PTSD ended his career. This is a story about facing your demons, changing your priorities, and having the courage to remake your entire life. Please welcome Jim Tritten to Bump in the Road. Jim, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Hi, Pat. Thank you for having me on the program today. I would like to share some of the events that have happened in my life which fit your criteria of a bump in the road. We've all had various different things happen to us where you had to recover, and that's just part of life. But how many people have had something happen where you almost died, near-death experience? And how did you recover from that? Because it's not just a physical component to it, but a psychological component, which can affect you for the rest of your life. So post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the diagnosis that I have, was, first of all, hard to figure out what was the problem, because I had a lot of physical things going wrong. And I had psychological things, but I didn't pay that much attention to them. I mean, I just figured I was getting old. but the physical things got to me, such as driving a car on a 2-lane road, and then I woke up. And by that, I mean I was driving the car, and I have no recollection of what happened. And the next thing I know is I was driving the car, but I was not where I was when I went out of it. And I had a number of those kind of things, as well as the typical things that are associated with PTSD, which is a loss of ability to control emotions. Men, we only have a couple of emotions, anger and humor. The rest are all learned experiences, usually from our wives or doctors. But we finally isolated it down to that there was something going on that wasn't normal. And so how do you find out what that is? Well, you become a professional patient for months and months. And finally, some doctor goes, we don't think there's anything physically wrong. We know there's something wrong, but there's nothing physically wrong. Why don't you go see a psychologist? Okay, well, that's a tough one for anybody who's working in the government with a security clearance to have to deal with. If I admit that I have seen a psychologist, I lose my security clearance. If I lose my security clearance, I lose my job. If I lose my job, this is not good. So finally, I had a doctor look at me and hand me a piece of paper, and he went, and I read it, and it said, "You're diagnosed with PTSD, and it's all attributable to an aircraft crash." And I went, whoa, really? So this was while I was still working for the government. And yes, I had had an aircraft crash almost 20 years earlier. And I didn't really think a lot about it. I didn't want to think a lot about it. But it was a near-death experience in which the aircraft was saved by me. We did not destroy the airplane, but we damaged it sufficiently that it was classified as an aircraft accident. And interestingly, I was the one who saved the aircraft. Had the other pilot remained in control of the aircraft, we would all be dead. But for whatever reason, I grabbed controls and I was able to get us out of, we'd hit the ground and I was able to get us airborne. And then after that, it was, okay, well, you gotta, I had to perform. I had to fly the airplane and bring it back to a landing and then deal with the aftermath. And the aftermath was typical for a 40-year-old Navy pilot. You ignored it. You didn't talk about it. You just completely blotted it out, and you went on, and I flew for an additional couple of years, but my flying skills deteriorated drastically to the point where I knew I was no longer safe, and I took an alternate route and did not fly anymore. And then I didn't really think about it. And I got stressors throughout the next 20 years, but I just attributed those to the things that I was doing. I was working hard. I had jobs with lots of pressure, and I went, yeah, that's why I'm having all these problems that I'm having thinking straight. Until finally one day, a totally unrelated to my aircraft accident event happened at work. And I'm sorry, I forgot if I said this, but I not only saved the aircraft, but then I got blamed for the accident. So 20 years later, I get blamed for something that I haven't done. I've actually done exactly what I was told to do. And then I got blamed for something that was not me. I didn't do it. And I lost it. I totally lost it at that point. So the bump in the road is an aircraft crash, but it really doesn't come home to roost until over 20 years later, when things happened. And as the VA psychologist, as I was telling this story to during my CNP exam, compensation and pension exam, he just said, "You were back in the cockpit. You were back being blamed." And I went, "Yes." And I lost it at that point, and I lost the ability to control myself, and was forced to retire. I retired from working for the government, and went out on a disability, and eventually got a disability from Social Security and a disability from the VA and a similar disability from the Navy. So is the bump in the road the aircraft crash, or the bump in the road the event that happens over 20 years later where I am brought back to that situation and have no longer got the ability to control it? And what did I do? I think that's the message for your readers or watchers. And what can you do once you have gotten past that point of the ability to control your emotions and your ability to control what you do and how you react to people? And I'd like to focus on that.
Well, it seems to me you have to confront it and integrate the experience somehow. Yeah.
I have chosen not to go back and relive that aircraft crash, although that is the initial cause of the problem. I'm just not prepared to do that. The VA is very good at what they do in treating PTSD, and they have a number of different methods of doing what's called exposure therapy, where you go back and relive the traumatic event, and then you either write it, and you keep writing it and writing it and writing it, and then eventually it becomes just a memory that you've written about, like any other memory that you've written about that isn't particularly interesting anymore. Or you do it verbally, and you sit down with a trained psychologist who walks you through telling the story over and over and over again, till again it is no longer a memory that will cause you angst. But because mine is so interrelated with the aircraft crash and then what happens 20 years later, I would rather do other types of treatment for PTSD. and they work. They are. I have used them. I've learned a lot from going to the VA sessions, and then participated in mental health sessions outside of the military or outside of the VA. And I've learned that the VA is really good at treatment in this area. And I have tried to then share that, what I learned and how to go about getting treatment, not being a counselor, but just explaining to people, okay, you could do this, you could try this, you could try this. And I have brought that kind of work into the civilian community, including into the criminal justice system.
I think PTSD touches all of us. I had an interesting experience recently, actually along these lines, not an aircraft crash, although I've had some pretty dubious landings. But what happened was I was told I was doing a very bad job at something, even though the results were stellar. And the results were numerical. You could measure it, and you could see that they were doing very well. And I responded really out of character. I was furious. I mean, beyond what was reasonable. And it forced me to look at this behavioral pattern of my own and see that throughout the years, what happened in this situation was the rug was pulled out from underneath me. Actually, I describe it as being stabbed, the knife was twisted, and then the rug was pulled out from underneath me. Well, you know what? I've had that same experience many times in my life. And I think I just kind of glossed over it, and I kept going and achieving. And I said it just didn't matter, but it did matter. And it finally rose, brought its ugly head up out of my psyche. And I realized, wow, these things we experience linger within us. I mean, they stay within our body, and they really influence the way we react to just about everything. It's subtle. It may not be obvious, but when we find ourselves acting either rotely or incredibly emotionally, there's something going on.
I agree with you that it lingers forever, and you don't know it's lingering. Let me rephrase that. I didn't know it was lingering. I didn't understand that all of this related to something that had happened a long, long time ago. And when I did, it was like, I can still remember, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we know what's wrong with you. Oh, great. What's that? PTSD. The bad news is, by definition, by legal definition, PTSD is a mental illness. Now, you focus on, I've just been told I have a mental illness. How do I get treatment? How can I continue to work? Can I continue to work? Do I need to make this the priority in my life, dealing with this, or can I try to get back to a quote normal life? And for me, the answer is I have to get up every day and remind myself I have a mental illness. I may not like that term, but if you want the money, if you want the treatment, that's what you got to sign up to. You got to admit you have a mental illness, okay? And then you got to realize how do I get treated by others? And what do I have to do to minimize the impact of my diagnosis? Easy ones are, don't be around places or people that remind you of the triggering event. And so that one is fairly easy, but it requires you to all of a sudden perhaps never see certain people ever again. And they may not understand why. And certainly not going back to places or not reliving the experiences. A number of years ago, I was writing a book, and I wanted to write. One of the things that I talked to my VA people about was, I said, well, I don't want to write about my aircraft crash, but I'll fictionalize aircraft crashes, and I'll write about an aircraft crash in my books and stories. And just bear with me. It'll be what's going on in my head, but it won't be the physical thing. So I went out to the airport where a friend of mine had arranged to meet her son, who was flying in an airplane to the airport, and a Navy airplane. And he agreed to talk with me. And so I went down to the airport. It was the exact aircraft I have never flown, but I wanted to crash in the book. And so we talked about how we would crash this airplane. And I was doing fine with that because it wasn't me and it wasn't my airplane. And I was taking notes and keeping track. And then naturally the guys wanted to know, because I'm a Navy pilot, they're Navy pilots. I'm retired, but they still wanted, well, what happened to you? And I made the mistake of telling them, and in great detail, because I knew they'd understand it. The next thing I know is I remember walking out of the aircraft. I remember approaching the terminal. And the next thing I knew was like 2 hours later, and I was home in bed. I have no idea how I got there. So that's why I don't talk about the aircraft crash. But I did write a very successful scene about that aircraft that I was in that day crashing, to the point where when I described what was happening at a conference and I was doing a live read, there was a retired Navy SEAL and down to my left, and I'm standing up at a podium, and I read this particularly gruesome and very, very accurate passage, and I heard him go, "Oh, Jesus." And I went, all right, I can do this. I can take my thoughts that I need to process. I know I need to process them, and distance them up just enough that I'm not affected, but other people are. They get what it was like to be inside the cockpit of an aircraft that crashed. And I didn't have to tell my story. I told a fictional story, but it worked. So I've used that technique a few times, and I've crashed a few airplanes, but never mine. And done as much as I could to keep myself busy, to keep the intrusive thoughts, the bad dreams away. And it seems to work. It's not a perfect life. It's not, I have PTSD. I have had to make major adjustments in my life, and I will never be the person I was before I was diagnosed. I'll never be that person again. That doesn't mean I'm a bad person. It just means that I won't be that person. I'm a new person. I'm totally reinvented, and I'm doing the best that I can. And some days it's reasonably good, and some days it's not so good.
What do you like about this new person?
I like the creativity that I have. When you work for the government, you can be creative. You may think that you actually, creativity is not appreciated, but that's not true. I loved working for the government. I worked half of my time for the Navy as on active duty and half of my time as a government civil servant, 44 years total. But I was still always working for somebody. And I was always, had to get permission to do whatever I wanted to do. I may have been given carte blanche, but I had to go get permission to do things. And I was very successful at work. And now I'm very successful at making things up. If I want to do something, I just do it. I don't have to get anybody's permission. I can sit there and write stories. I can experiment. I don't have to do anything to become successful. If it comes, fine. I don't care. What I care about is staying busy. Staying busy to me is both a symptom of PTSD. That's what I did for 20 years until I was diagnosed. I was so damn busy I didn't know what was wrong. Now I stay busy for the reason that it's a good coping skill. It's a way that my head is in a good state of mind. So, for example, I've been writing since high school, but I wrote boring academic stuff or flying stuff until I retired. And then it was, okay, well, what do you want to write? You can write about anything you want. So again, men know about anger and humor. I decided I'd write humor. And I loved it because I was in a frame of mind where I was trying to be funny and trying to make people laugh and see the humor in what I wrote just because of the way I wrote it or the way they read it. And I either said it or they read. But I learned I could do it. And when I learned I could do it, I went to the VA every week, and I would be in a recreation therapy program where you do writing. And I'd read a story, and I'd bring the house down. They'd be laughing and having a good time, and I go, "This is great. This is a win-win." I felt good doing it, writing it, and I feel good reading it, and they feel good hearing it. And for some of those guys, it may be the only time they laugh all week long. And so that was how I started with the post-career writing. And since then, I have dabbled in virtually every genre to experiment. Why? Because I can do it. I don't have, I don't have to go say to the admiral, "Hey, can I write this?" No. Or he tells me what you want to write. No, I just decided I wanted to write this genre for this month and try it out and see how I liked it. Sometimes I liked it. Sometimes I really liked it. I never really hated anything that I have done since then. But it's an integral part of my treatment plan. And I commend the VA for having the creative writing groups. And since then, I've branched out and been involved with a lot of different programs involving writing and veterans.
You've had you have an amazing writing career. Talk about it a little bit, because it's very impressive.
I've been very fortunate. Not everything that I write do people see. That's part of the deal too. Sometimes those inner thoughts that I really don't want to unveil, I write well, and then they never see the light of day. But they get them off my chest. And sometimes it takes time before you're ready to write about something. My mother passed almost 2 years ago now, and it took me to about a year and a half before I could sit down and process her passing. And I did that by writing about it. And I wrote about it in a way that surprised me, but it worked. At the end of writing that, I was done. I had processed my mother's passing. It was a very good tool to use, and I'm glad I did it. So now I do that regularly. If I've got something going on, and so that would be like a journal, but it's not. I'm not doing journaling. I'm instead it's up here until it's ready to burst, and then it just has to come out, and then I just sit down, and sometimes I write incredibly good stuff inside of 15 minutes. And sometimes it takes me a year to think about what I want to write. And sometimes I write about it and it takes 10 years before anybody else ever sees it.
I don't think that's uncommon, though, among writers. Do you?
No.
I mean, I can say I've only done one book, and I've been hesitating on getting this next book done. And I'm not sure why I'm hesitating. And I think part of it is I need to just start putting it down and letting it evolve, and then I'll have some direction for where I want it to go. But it's so interesting to listen to you talk about your fictional books. I've thought about that too. Gosh, if you could imagine anything, if you could write anything, if you could tell any story, what would you tell?
Yeah.
They're just infinite possibilities.
And what I like about fiction is that you have much more freedom to get your message across. I mean, you're writing for entertainment normally, if you're writing fiction. But if the other hand, if you can slip something in that will help inform the reader, I think that's inside what's doable, and I have learned how to master that. So I have a trilogy. 2 books are completely done. One is up here, ready to burst, and it'll be done within the next year or two. But I went into those books knowing there were messages I wanted the reader to take away, and I never wanted to use those words. I didn't want to use the words I wanted them to conclude with, and that they would get by reading the book, and maybe they were entertained. And if they weren't entertained, then they probably wouldn't read the book. But I learned that when I was teaching, and I used to use serious stuff to teach, and then I decided, no, let's use this fictional account, because then we have more latitude on what we can say and what we can talk about. And so that's the model that I chose, was using fiction as a method to inform readers about what they don't know. So, for example, one of the major lessons that is included in the first book of the trilogy, but not the second, but in the first one, is there are many more behaviors that someone with PTSD will exhibit other than buying a gun and killing people. And I spend hundreds of pages challenging my main character, and sometimes it's fight or flight, and he flights. He doesn't stay and fight. And so I keep ratcheting up what is happening to this poor guy, until finally he is triggered in such a way that he can no longer run. He has to take a stand, and he does something that I hope the readers will forgive him for. And that's the essence of what PTSD is like. You face those kind of choices all the time. If I get into a stressful situation, the best answer for me is to get up and leave that situation or get away from those people. Don't sit there and argue with them. Don't sit there and try to tell them, why you feel what you do. Just go away. Take care of myself first, like on the airplane, right? When the little oxygen mask comes down, put yours on first before you put it on your children. I take care of myself. I do what I have to do to take care of myself, and I avoid people and places that don't make me happy.
But I think that's a recipe for good mental health for everybody. And I would argue that almost everybody has some degree of PTSD. And I find the idea that they categorize it absolutely as a mental disease, I don't think that's really spot on. I can understand the rationale to some extent, particularly within a bureaucracy. But I think if you go across the population, people have trauma, and trauma lends itself to PTSD, I think, more often than not.
No, I agree with you. And that's why when I opened, I said, as much as I didn't like the phrase, if you want the money and if you want the treatment, that's where the bureaucracy classifies it. And you have to accept it. And a lot of people that I know, I've been to underground support groups, and trust me, there are lots of people who are diagnosed that will not accept it. They will not seek treatment because they don't want mental health in their record, or they don't believe it's a real mental health. It's mental health. Well, if it's not mental health, what is it? I don't argue with it. It's just, okay, I want treatment. I got treatment. That's the price I have to pay. And that price is actually high sometimes, where I have had to learn it is better for me to get new friends than to try to hold on to the old friends who don't help me or don't understand what's going on with me and want the old Jim back, or use phrases like, why don't you just get over it? That's not helpful to me. I can't do either of those two things. So just divorce yourself from those people and places and make new friends who understand or accept you for the way you are.
If you were to advise somebody looking at a PTSD diagnosis, what would you say to them?
Well, I often am brought into groups and speak, especially the underground groups where you have law enforcement officers and people who have been in the military. They then got a good job because they were very good at what they did, and then they're now suffering later the impact of their military career. And I look at them and I go, you got a choice. You either seek treatment and change your jobs and change your wife and change your where you live and all that stuff. Seek treatment. That's a path, and admit that you've got this and reinvent yourself, or do like I did. Go for 20 years not realizing it, and then go for another 10 years. I think it may have even been more than 10. It may have been 10 or 15 years where I knew, and I obviously did not seek treatment. I consciously avoided it, didn't do it, and I was able to then dig myself so far into a hole that the only recourse was to retire on disability. And I said, the choice is yours. Do it your way or do it my way. But I said, there's as much as you don't want to seek treatment and change your whole life when you're in your 30s or your 40s, it may be the best thing you ever did. I'll never know because I didn't do it. So look at me, look at how I ended my working career, and say to yourself, that's what you're going to get. You're very likely to end up in that same path that Jim was in. And do I want to do that or not?
Those are impossible choices. You know that?
Yeah.
I think remaking your life, though, is something a lot of people face for different reasons. Sometimes it has to do with maybe alcohol or drugs. They have to change their entire network of people.
Right.
Sometimes it has to do with divorce. It can have to do with illness. Certainly, I've seen in the cancer community where people's social networks just fall apart, fall by the wayside. And I think that's just really hard. Nobody gives us a recipe for this, you know?
No. That's why I spent a lot of years leading support groups through the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, a great organization, and they permitted me to first become a member of a support group, and then lead a support group, and then be a state trainer, where I trained all the people in my state who then became facilitators, and then take the program into jails and the prisons, where there was a target-rich environment there. There were lots of people who needed help, and you didn't have to worry about whether they would come. They were there, and they wanted to get better. And so one of the most proud things I've ever done in my life, and I've done some things that I'm very proud of, but one of the absolute most proud is one gentleman who I met in our local lockup who really wanted to beat it. He was in his mid-30s when I met him, and he'd spent almost his entire adult life incarcerated one way or the other. And we trained him to be a facilitator. He led groups inside the jail. He then led, when he was released, he led groups outside the jail, and he's become a very big volunteer for NAMI, but he's never been back in jail. Never. And that, you have jobs in which I've had jobs in which you're trying to run the world, bigger than one, but one person. I helped one person in a way that really, really mattered. And I'm proud of that. I'm proud of him for having changed his entire life.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.